Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaver here, sort of kind of with Michelle Whitty. We have another hour of live radio for you here on Radio Sputnik. Get ready to continue to go against the grain. Lots to cover over the next hour, including more sanctions by the U.S. against the entire world at this point, Trump's rollback of environmental policies in order to build more things that destroy the environment, and major shakeups inside of Trump's campaign team. Things are falling apart rather quickly, or maybe they're just beginning, Michelle. Last time, Trump had quite a few changes at the top of his campaign. Didn't really work out that great for Russiagate stories, but it worked out well considering he won, so maybe switching it up for him won't be all that bad. We'll talk about that and much more over the course of the next hour. As always, you can give us a tweet at Sputnik Misfits, or you can reach us at 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Here to join us to talk about all of those. So a special treat if you do call in. You can talk with Michelle, myself, and Caleb Maupin, a journalist and political analyst who focuses his coverage on U.S. foreign policy and the global system of monopoly, capitalism, and imperialism. Caleb, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Pleasure to be here.
I read the way in which I had it in my script there. I had monopoly and capitalism on separate lines, and I just thought you were an expert on Monopoly, the game. So I don't know if you like the game, but it's more than just Monopoly.
It's a game that never ends. It just keeps going. It takes too long.
Will it possibly ever? Will it just please end at some point? Maybe it will ever end. One thing that doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon, Caleb, is Donald Trump's usage of foreign sanctions. Venezuela gets sanctioned, China gets sanctions, Cuba gets sanctions, and hey, why not a third serving of sanctions for Russia? Just to know for you liberals who heard Trump and Russia in the same sentence and yelled, conspiracy! Sanctions are not some yummy dessert or things countries want. They are aggressive acts of war. Yes, Trump put sanctions on Russia. Let me tell you more about that. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced yesterday that the U.S. State Department plans to include Nordstream 2 and Turkstream in the list of projects to be sanctioned by Washington under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA legislation. In a press conference yesterday, Pompeo said, today, the Department of State is updating the public guidance for CAATSA authorities to include Nordstream 2 and the second line of Turkstream 2. This action puts investments or other activities that are related to these Russian energy export pipelines at risk of U.S. sanctions. It's a clear warning to companies aiding and abetting Russia's malign influence projects that will not be tolerated. Get out now or risk the consequences, he said. Later, the State Department did clarify that it would not be introducing sanctions against the pipelines immediately, but could do so in the future. Phew, okay, just loud threats. Caleb, America sure loves talking about free and open markets, but hey, they're working pretty hard here to control the global flow of oil and trying to force actors to solely work with the U.S.
Indeed. Well, back in the 1990s, when Russia was an economic basket case, and you had mass unemployment and hunger, and they were importing all their food because their food system had fallen apart, and Boris Yeltsin was imposing, free market policies that resulted in mass death. The U.S. government and the Russian government were getting along very, very well. The Clinton administration and the Yeltsin administration were getting along great. But things changed in, the beginning of the 21st century. We had Vladimir Putin come in. He began to restructure the Russian economy around two state-controlled mega corporations, Gazprom, a state-controlled natural gas company, and Rosneft, a state-controlled oil company. And when he did that, that resulted in an economic renaissance in Russia. Russia's economy rebooted. And it was finally in 2006 that Russia actually reached the industrial output level that the Soviet Union had in the 1980s. So Putin brought Russia out of the disaster of the fall of the Soviet Union, restructured the economy around state-controlled energy exports, and Russia began selling oil and gas on the international markets. And as Russia reemerged as an oil and gas competitor, selling oil and natural gas in competition with British Petroleum and Chevron and BP and ExxonMobil, when Russia emerged as a competitor with American super major oil corporations, and that's Wall Street tied in with our big banks. At that point, Russia became a geopolitical rival of the United States, and suddenly we began to hear about, how Putin was a dictator, about how the Russians are no good and how we need to beat them back and all of this. And it flows with an effort to preserve what the White House is very open about at this point. The Trump White House talks about energy dominance, making sure that U.S. oil and gas corporations have dominance in the global market. that no strong competitor can exist. And that's what I think the targeting of this Nordstream 2 pipeline is really about. They don't like the fact that countries around the world can choose to buy their natural gas from Russia rather than from American companies.
Well, tell me more about this because, right, it's one thing to anger and piss off Russia and go after Russia, but it's another thing seemingly, I don't even want to say allies anymore because what is going on with our allies at this point? But obviously this is like upsetting Germany and European actors. Angela Merkel has spoken out plenty about the sanctions. And you have Klaus Ernst, the left party chairman of the Bundestag Committee on Economic Affairs and Energy, saying yesterday he has called the U.S. sanctions pressure a threat to Germany's sovereignty and urged leaders to stop babbling and consider retaliatory measures such as penalties on U.S. gas imports. Will we see any retaliation by Germany or the EU?
Well, we've already started to see Germany talk about taking moves and such, because you have to remember, you just look at a map, okay? Germany, needs to import natural gas from somewhere. Now, is it cheaper to import it from Russia or from the United States? Now, it's pretty obvious that importing natural gas to Germany from Russia is going to cost way, way, way less than importing it all the way from the United States. So we now have the United States trying to twist the arm of the Germans and force them to import natural gas from the other side of the planet rather than from their next door neighbor in Russia because the United States says so. And of course, you can understand why the Germans wouldn't be too happy about that. They would say, look, okay, we're going to be paying almost twice as much for natural gas if we buy it from the Americans. Why can't we buy it from the Russians? And why can't we make that decision for ourselves? Why is the United States trying to coerce us with sanctions and threats and such into buying natural gas from them? And I can see why many Germans would resent that. And the rise, I think, of opposition parties in Germany, whether it's Die Linke on the left, which is more of a socialist and left-wing party, or the Alternative for Germany, the ADL party, that's emerging on the right, ADP. Both of those parties are a response to the fact that Germany feels like it's being coerced by NATO and by the United States to work against its own economic interests. The United States has decided Russia is a rival, that they want to push Russia off the market. And Germany is basically, being threatened unless they go along with it, even though it just economically, on paper, in black and white, doesn't make sense.
Sorry, Caleb, Michelle Whitty here. You say look at a map so casually, as though we're not even Americans. with real problems understanding geography and how that affects our lives, right, Bob?
Yeah, and just looking at maps here, I mean, it's really saddening to think, too, how much we've really shown interest in stopping and blocking other people around the world. I'm curious what these sanctions get us at the end of the day, Caleb, because it seemingly is only decrediting our power as a global power. It seems like this is part of our downfall. I mean, if you look at a map of where the U.S. passport gets you right now, it's not many places. And obviously that's the coronavirus, but it's wild to think I can't even travel to Europe. I mean, it's like they forgot the color of my passport. I got the blue passport. But economy in China is now growing. You're seeing countries develop deepening ties to one another outside of the U.S. And if everybody's just being sanctioned by the U.S. and getting annoyed and mocking Donald Trump, where does that leave the U.S. at the end of the day? We can have all the oil in the world, but we're not going to have anywhere to sell it, and we're not going to have any global standing to do anything with that power.
Indeed. And now that Britain is out of the European Union, many European Union countries are less supportive of and less tied to that American-British axis that seems to dominate the world economy. And the Belt and Road and the Asian Infrastructure Bank is expanding across Europe. And there are many folks in Europe who just feel like, why not explore getting closer to Russia? Why not explore getting closer to China? Why not explore using Huawei technologies from China, for their telecommunications? Why do they need to default support the United States? And I think that question is in the minds of many people in Europe. And that's underlying this pressure from the United States to kind of force European countries to continue exclusively doing business with the United States and with the West and not exploring the Eurasian alternative of Russia and China.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where the United States goes to continue to exert its power. And exactly what is the goal at the end of the day, you wonder, Michelle, where the U.S. is even aiming its desires. Is it simply just to be the never-ending power as the world completely collapses? Caleb, just one last question on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I am curious how much of it is a big FU to Ukraine. I mean, Russia and Ukraine going back here, obviously having big fights over Gazprom, over the price of gas and oil. And basically now Russia is working around Ukraine, and Ukraine at a point there was being enticed by NATO and the European Union by joining their side, and Russia basically sidestepping it. It seems like a pretty stealth move, to say the least, to take Ukraine out of its power as a geopolitical actor?
Sure. Well, in 2014, the United States heavily meddled in Ukrainian politics, and it began boosting up the most anti-Russian, the most, the most hostile to Russia, most pro-EU elements in Ukrainian politics. We saw the Euromaidan event. And the United States, put a huge amount of influence. There were all kinds of nonprofits and NGOs that were, fomenting anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine and boosting up people in the western regions of the country that have an anti-Russian feeling. And as a result of that, we saw the crisis. We saw Crimea voting to join with Russia, and we saw the conflict that began in the eastern regions of the Ukraine. I mean, this is the United States meddling in Ukrainian politics, and as a result, Russia seeing a threat and mobilizing to maintain its economic security and make sure that hostile conditions don't continue to arise on its borders.
Cool. Thanks, Trump. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Thanks, Obama. Great work there. We do have a caller on the line, Keith. Keith calling in, hopefully to laugh at Michelle's joke or have any comments you want to share with us. Keith, what's happening?
Yes, Caleb, I'm a big fan of yours. Thank you for your informative, waking up. In the United States of amnesia, we need a Caleb Maupin, to tell the truth. Now, what I wanted to say was this show today has done something that I was thinking about just as this show came on, and that was about Henry Kissinger's comment when he was Secretary of State. And I'm paraphrasing. If you want to control the world, if you want to control the population of a country, you do it with food. If you want to control a nation, you do it with energy. But if you want to control the entire world, you do it with the world's reserve currency. Now, to that end, the Africans are kept in a situation where they can't be food secure, because if you're food secure, that's one less nail in the coffin for you. And if you get your own energy, then you don't need to buy our, petrodollar oil. And that's why we had the conflict in Ukraine, because that was about a pipeline. And now the Nordstream, you're going to punish your European cousins with sanctions if you don't buy our liquefied natural gas that has to be shipped all the way across the ocean, which is almost a third more. So I just wanted to say that this all dovetails with your first guest and what we're talking about now. And Caleb, can you comment on this? Thank you.
Sure. When it comes to the dollar being the currency, the petrodollar, the fact that you could only buy oil in U.S. dollars, enabled a huge amount of dominance for American energy corporations. For example, in the 1990s, there was an episode of mass starvation in North Korea. It was because North Korea could no longer import oil. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the only way one could import oil and purchase oil was with U.S. dollars. North Korea was subject to U.S. sanctions. So their food production system came to a grinding halt as a result of the fact they couldn't import petroleum to put in their tractors and grow their food with. And they call it the arduous march now in North Korea. And there were millions of deaths as a result of this, petrodollar policy and the U.S. dominance. Many people have also pointed out that Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, when it was an Islamic socialist country prior to the 2011 NATO intervention, he had been really pushing the idea of an independent African currency and Africa to develop its own currency to establish a level of economic independence. So, yes, the U.S. dollar hegemony has been one way that Wall Street and London have kept the world poor so that they can stay rich.
Yeah, another big story out today is a continued turning on of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which also will bring more energy there to the people of Africa finally. So good for them in that move. Obviously, plenty of controversy around that, but maybe something we can cover over the next week as the dam gets up and running. Caleb, I wanted to pivot a little bit here to talk about how Trump's not only angering citizens around the world, he's also angering people like myself and others in the U.S. who care about the environment. Trump announced yesterday that he is rolling back a Nixon-era environmental law that he says stifles infrastructure projects. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 changed environmental oversight in the United States by requiring federal agencies to consider whether a project would harm the air, land, water, or wildlife, and giving the public the right of review and input. But away with that. The rollback will now make it easier to build highways, pipelines, chemical and solar plants, and other projects. And by easier, I mean will allow for construction companies to build without having to think about the impact of their projects on local communities or the environment. Now, get the logic behind here what Donald Trump said yesterday in Georgia. He said, we won't get certain projects through for environmental reasons. They have to be environmentally sound. But you know what? We're going to know in a year. We're going to know in a year and a half. We're not going to know in 20 years. Not even sure what he was going there for. I guess he was saying, why predict the environmental damages that may come when we can just do them and see the environmental damages themselves? Obviously, plenty of people on both sides were either alarmed or appreciated the move. Brett Hartle, government affairs director at the Center for Biological Diversity, said of the decision, this may be the single biggest giveaway to polluters in the last 40 years. And of course, others celebrated the move, like the great Ann Bradbury, CEO of the American Exploration and Production Council, a trade group for oil and gas explorers, who said, modernizing and clarifying NEPA could not come at a better time for the country as we're recovering from COVID-19. Not quite sure we're at recovery yet, but sure, let's build and destroy the environment when we're destroying people's health. Caleb, I'm always curious with these moves like this. Is it greed or ignorance? Obviously, it's some combination of the two, but does Donald Trump and others really, truly not see climate change and the impact it's having on their populations? Are they blinded by greed, blinded by the need to build at any cost?
Well, I think that there's a division among the rich and powerful in the United States, and that Trump represents probably the majority of wealthy Americans who feel like, the government is unfair, is holding back their creativity and their brilliance and their ability to get rich by constructing things. There's a whole lot of millionaires and billionaires in the United States who feel like they're locked out of the club. And they look at, some of the entrenched dynasties based in New England. You talk about the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the DuPont, and they feel like even though they're millionaires and billionaires, they're not part of the club that has real influence and power in the United States. And that the Trump presidency very much represents the lower levels of American capital. The hotel chain owners, the fracking companies that compete with big oil, that feel like they've been locked out, and they want the government to be more, quote unquote, libertarian or neoliberal in its economic policies, and not try to regulate and control things. And they kind of, you notice when Trump came into office first, he immediately started drilling on public lands. He lifted a lot of environmental restrictions. He lifted a lot of Obama-era regulations on Wall Street. And a lot of those lower-level capitalists really started making a lot of profits. And that was why Trump said the economy was doing so well. But it only lasted for so long. I mean, some of the underlying problems that we have with the elimination of labor, with high tech, with the lower standard of living for the next generation of workers, and the decline of the U.S. middle class and infrastructure decay, it didn't address any of those problems. But it did kind of allow some of those lower levels of American capital to start making kind of a lot more profits than they used to do, lifting a lot of the restrictions imposed by the Obama administration, probably on behalf of those higher levels of capital in the hopes of stabilizing things. So we have one faction, that's in with the Democrats, with Biden and such, that wants stability, that wants to kind of, keep things in U.S. society stable and in order. We have another capital that just wants to make as much money as they possibly can and believes that if the government stays out, everything will be perfect. There's two different approaches among the American rich and powerful. There's one faction that favors stability, the other faction that favors, unregulated markets and lots of profits. And I think that's the division we're seeing playing out. And Trump is appealing to his base of folks who feel like the environmental laws are unnecessary and rigged against them.
Yeah, it's remarkable, too, given the environmental impacts and the conditions here in this country, Michelle, that those poor people in many communities that are supporting Trump are actually those living closest to Superfund sites or toxic waste sites. There, a report out just a couple of days ago showed that 70% of the country's most environmentally contaminated sites are within 1 mile of federally assisted housing, according to the report from the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. But it's not just poor communities now. At the end of the fiscal year 2016, approximately 53 million people live within 3 miles of a Superfund site. That is roughly 16% of the U.S. population. Between Trump's latest move and Biden's halfway there measures, it feels like the U.S. and the world are a bit doomed here, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, that 16% is a pretty surprising figure, but I guess with regulations like this being pared away, we shouldn't be surprised at it, because there are lots of people who are going to be happy to just dump things in rivers. And also, I think there's a sense of, I don't know, I saw this actually when I was hiking last year, this sense that people still really feel as though it should be their right to do whatever they want within their communities without thinking about the impact that it's going to have on an overall, say, waterway or forest. And I hiked through these small, and I have to say also very friendly and very welcoming communities along the West Coast, who were still really angry that they were stopped from dredging their rivers or clear-cutting forests. I remember seeing a box of spotted owl helper on the shelf in one particular cafe. I don't know if you guys remember the whole spotted owl flap. It was one of the first big environmental fights in the U.S. that I remember from my youth. And I mean, I think, of course, that they should not have the leeway to do literally whatever they want on their land and not care about what happens to people who live downriver from them. But I also have to see some of these places have been sort of, regulated and then kind of left behind. So yeah, I can see that these will also be exactly the places that are going to find that they're not allowed to eke out whatever sort of living that they had been doing before that was degrading to the environment. They're also not going to be helped by the government to find other ways to live. And pretty soon they're going to be living next door to whatever kind of waste a huge corporation wants to dump nearby.
Yeah, it's remarkable. 4 miles away is the safe distance to live away from a Supermax spot. So yeah, plenty of Superfund spot, not safe to live next to major prisons either. But anyways, Caleb, let me also ask you now, we know now Donald Trump's angered the world, angered people in his own country. What does this mean for Donald Trump's re-election efforts, especially now that he's had to replace his campaign manager, Brad Parscale? Bill Steppen, who is now the currently deputy campaign manager and a veteran political operative, will take over the campaign. This comes on top of some pretty bad poll numbers, at least at the surface. Let me say here at the surface, a Quinnipiac survey released has Biden up 15 percentage points, nearly double the margin he had in the same poll last month. And an NBC Wall Street Journal survey released yesterday, Biden led Trump by 11 points. The Quinnipiac poll also found that voters believe Mr. Biden would be better than Trump at handling a crisis, 57% to 38%, handling healthcare, 58 to 35%, and responding to the coronavirus, 59 to 35%, and addressing racial inequality. Here's the biggest gap here, 62 to 30%. So yeah, not great results there, Caleb, but somehow, still, Trump still has the confidence of a majority of Americans regarding the handling of the economy. The NBC News and Wall Street poll found that 54% approved of Donald Trump's handling of the economy. If it comes down to the economy, stupid, Trump may not be as bad off as many people are predicting.
Well, I'll just say this, that I think Donald Trump is probably, in a good spot right now. I mean, things are looking good for him despite the poll numbers because, Americans don't go to the polls to vote against somebody. They go to the polls to vote for somebody. And whenever the election is about you win, right? If you looked at the Obama election, it was a referendum. Are you for Obama or are you against him? Well, Obama won. Obama's re-election, right? 2012. Are you for Obama or are you against him? He won. Well, the 2016 election very much became, are you for Trump or are you against him? So Trump won. And unless Joe Biden can become more of the story and Joe Biden can become more of a center of gravity for himself, and unless people can get excited about Joe Biden, I think Trump has got this in the bag because basically if the election is about you in the United States, you win. People don't go to the polls to vote against somebody. They go to the polls because they're excited to vote for someone. And I think right now it looks pretty good for Trump.
Yeah, I mean, Caleb, I remain skeptical that Trump can pull out of this, but I think that is a really good point. And I wonder if the Democrats are really fatally overestimating their popularity as a brand. As you say, with Biden out of sight, they are simply hoping that the Democratic Party is enough to sway people away from Trump. And, I'm still going to say I don't think it looks good for him now, but I do think that could be a very big error on their part.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just say, too, Caleb, what's remarkable to me, if it's like the economy is the main thing that's holding Trump together, how are the Democrats not solely focusing in on the economy? If record profits for big banks, while the GOP is trying to cut unemployment benefits to millions, and yet Trump's still the clear leader on the economy, and Biden's putting out ads that we played yesterday on being a good commander-in-chief and leading us in wartime. How do you get this messaging so wrong? Why are they unable to focus on a coherent message?
Well, I think that centrist wing of the Democratic Party is very afraid of economic populism. And if you saw the response to Bernie Sanders, that populism is something that's been tolerated among conservative circles in the United States. Right-wing populism seems to be rising and tolerated and even promoted, by Fox News and such. But left-wing populism is something that the Democratic establishment seems to be very, very, very afraid of. If they're going to really open that up and start talking about the working class and start talking about healthcare and education and bank bailouts. And, if they started really, moving in the direction of almost a Jeremy Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders, I think that there's a lot of wealthy donors to the Democratic Party and a lot of very entrenched, powerful interests that would be very, very afraid of pushing those buttons. And it's almost like the Democrats are afraid to go as far as the Republicans are in energizing their base. And that's a consistent pattern in U.S. politics for the past 50, 60 years.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I just could kind of deepen what you had said about how people go out to vote for somebody, I do think there was a subset of people that really voted for Trump against Hillary Clinton. I think she was so uniquely hated. I mean, there was people, the Never Hillary crowd as well, that were out there. And I think that was part of the problem. And I think the Democrats are just assuming, well, if anybody could have beat Trump except Hillary Clinton, we can run anybody, even the oldest person ever to be president who is not able to have coherent thoughts whatsoever. But I think the problem, Michelle, that the Democrats are also just being blind to, and it's just kind of wishful thinking, is that they think people will go back to the Democratic Party. I mean, a lot of these people, it's like 200 some counties that went Obama, Trump. And now basically what you're trying to find out is how to get them to go to Obama, Trump, Biden, which is just back to Obama basically in a way. But I think a lot of people realize that Obama did not follow through on his economic promises. You're seeing now Trump, for many people, not delivering whatsoever. And you can't just assume American people are lazy and dumb and just will simply blindly go back to the Democratic Party. And if they don't make an appeal to pull them back, it's just not going to work. And it's just, again, it's really frustrating how much the Democrats, Michelle, just take people for granted and what they actually believe in and actually have fully formed political thoughts.
Yes. And also, I mean, you could say doing anything to energize their base. I might say doing anything to, in fact, support their traditional base, because I think the Democrats are not running with an economic message because they don't have an appealing, coherent economic message that they can give to the people in this country who are hurting. And actually, when I was thinking about okay, so who's the traditional base of the Democratic Party and who is their sort of new base, which is, people who are not suffering economically, but who want to appear socially conscious and anti-racist and all of that stuff that is good, right? But I don't know if these are enough people to sway an election. I was thinking amazingly, they're being given an amazing gift right now by the Trump administration, because in this time with having people in the streets, having this really renewed understanding among the white population of this country of just how much violence the Black and brown populations have been facing for such a long time, and having this kind of solidarity arise, it kind of seems like all the Trump administration would need to do is be reasonable in any way on race. And instead, they are handing the Democrats this incredible gift of promoting manifest destiny and giving these unhinged speeches in front of Mount Rushmore and defending the Confederate flag. And I think if the Democrats manage to lose in the face of this, there will have to be some kind of reckoning with what the party has become and whether it can hold. Because, I mean, honestly, the Republicans could be doing very little to make it worse for themselves now.
Well, I'll say this, though. There are a lot of older folks in the key swing states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Minnesota who have a lot of resentment. And their reaction to an upsurge of anti-racist protests is going to be a lot of resentment and a lot of feeling like somehow they're under attack. This is a personal attack against them. And that could drive them into the Trump camp very solidly. And that there's a consistent pattern of that, of older folks, low-income white people who respond to an upsurge of anti-racist protests by becoming more resentful and more supportive of the Trumpish kind of message. And so sometimes these kind of things can backfire, because some people don't react with enthusiasm to these things, unfortunately.
Caleb, I wanted just to take an extra minute here with you just to talk about what happens next with social protests in the United States. Again, there one place in which Joe Biden's leading Donald Trump there is on the response to the social injustices, which is absolutely absurd, again, given the handling by the Democrats of these issues been just as awful as Republicans. But I don't know if you saw yesterday the continued protest there calling for justice for Breonna Taylor. 87 people, including the NFL's Kenny Stills, being arrested for sitting basically at the Attorney General of Kentucky's home, demanding that he arrested the police officers that killed Breonna Taylor. The arrested were charged with intimidating a participant in the legal process, a felony, as well as a misdemeanor disorderly conduct and criminal trespass. if electoral politics has nothing to say to these social movements, to the protesters that are happening right now, where did the social protest go?
Well, I mean, there's an explosion happening in this country right now. I mean, this country has moved very, very much toward a police state amid economic decline. The policing agencies, both local and federal, have been beefed up. Police repression has been enhanced, and communities of color that have long, felt harsher repression than other folks in this country have been really, really, feeling the pain of that rising police state and mass incarceration. And an explosion is taking place. And it's very, very powerful. And if it doesn't find expression among the Democratic Party, it might go elsewhere, because there's a lot of people in this country that just aren't going to take it any longer. And when you strip away economic opportunities, but replace economic opportunities with the boot heels of repression and prisons and law enforcement and police everywhere and violations of civil liberties, the response is often quite explosive. And I think we're seeing that right now, no question about it.
Yeah, explosive nonetheless there. And we talked about at the top of the hour what was happening in Portland. I mean, it just continues to escalate. And once there's one trigger, Michelle, it's one of these things that I think the protests will continue to feed themselves. We continue to see police brutality. We continue to see protesters beaten and arrested. And it just seems like it's going to continue to spur on more and more protests well into November. Well, with that, though, we are unfortunately out of time with Caleb Maupin. We don't want to monopolize too much of your time, Caleb. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people find more of you and your work online?
Oh, just check out my website, Caleb Maupin. That's CalebMaupin.com.
Very cool. That was Caleb Maupin. Thank you so much for joining. We take a quick break before coming back with our Trends with Benefits segment here on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in DC. We're back after this.